me get into it. So when I started this, I was like, I'm just going to talk about cool mine fire or like talk about the fact that industry towns are inherently exploitative. And what I found was like, yes, that, but also like so much more. So what is haunting
So
in
interesting.
Centralia? Yeah, I'm like fascinated. I was like, at this, when I was researching, I was like, wow, I didn't really expect it to be this whole thing. And then I was like, but I'm also really glad I learned about it. Because it's, like,
Yeah.
very close to where we live, and I know we had, like, planned to visit it, and
Mhm.
hopefully, honestly, might go take a look one day, but, it didn't happen this year in time for the episode, uh, but it
That
is,
doesn't
like,
mean
pretty.
no forever.
Exactly. There is always time until we no longer exist, which will hopefully not happen anytime soon, friends. So, Centralia, PA is fairly well known for inspiring games like Silent Hill and is now abandoned due to a mine fire that forced the evacuation of the town because of carbon monoxide leaks, sinkholes, and like other things. In fact, the town has been burning since 1962, which is a lot of time. It's 2022 right now. That is many, many
Mhm.
years, according to math. Um, and I'll get into like that piece of it later. But what was even more interesting about Centralia is that it has this pretty complex history that would give some more reasons slash cause for it to be haunted than honestly the fire does.
Mm.
And what's wild is that like 90% of what it's known for is these fires. And
Mhm.
all the other stuff I read was like I had to like search for it.
Yeah.
Like I had it mentions one thing and I'm like, well, why doesn't it like talk about that more? That's interesting. And then I had to Google what that thing was and like went down this entire rabbit hole of like links and like
Oh,
Googling different
wow.
things because like it was not organized in a way that made it simple to connect all the dots.
Yeah.
And that was intentional because
Oh.
industries really don't like strikes and they really don't like
Mhm.
unions. And they want people to also not like unions. And they don't want them to know that to get rid of unions, there's been like a lot of messed up stuff that's happened, specifically in Pennsylvania and other areas of the country where they like literally enslaved people and then murdered them
Mhm.
through the law because they were like, "You did this thing," and they were like, "Yeah, I mean, we did, but that's because you like wouldn't feed us and made us work insane hours without paying us fairly and like exploited this entire group of people." And we were like, "Let's not do that." And then you're like, "Okay, but also then." You're the only one who gets consequences. The business never gets consequences. The
Always.
government never gets consequences. So essentially, there's like a lot of controversy around what I'm going to talk about in that lots of people like don't want you to know that that's what happened. So let me get into it. Before Centralia became Centralia, before the invasion of settlers, it was land that belonged to the Lenni Lenape and the Susquehannock people. I found this information on that cool link that we've mentioned previously. It's native-land.ca, which is a map that lets you know what native land you're on.
Mhm.
And it said that Pennsylvania seized that land and sold it to colonials for about 500 pounds in 1749,
Mm.
and essentially like made all the native people leave. Uh,
Yeah.
and after that, it like didn't get better from there. So on centraliapa.org, there's some information on the town's history, specifically that in 1770, after it had been purchased for 500 pounds, it was not settled by actual colonial settlers until the 1770s, and then was acquired by Robert Morris in 1793, who was a Revolutionary War vet and signer of the Declaration of Independence. And as a fun fact, he went bankrupt in 1798 and had to like sell the land again, and then was sent to debtor's prison. So this like already not starting great, like already started bad. And it was many years before like the town was heard about again. Like no one was really
Mhm.
talking about it. But then in 1830, the land was sold again at auction in Philadelphia to Stephen Girard.
Hmm.
They purchased the entirety of Morris lands, which includes Centralia, for 30K because they theorized that coal could be found in that area. and that was valid in that there was lots of that. And they created a bunch of mines as a result. Gerard specifically was not the one to do this. He didn't do much with the land, so his purchasing wasn't that much of note, other than an additional fun fact for you. But essentially, Bull's Head Tavern was founded by Jonathan Faust in 1832, right next to about where the town was founded, and it was given the same name initially. It was Bull's Head name as the
Hmm.
town. And then the land was purchased by the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company in 1842, which is when the land started to be worked on and transformed into a mining town. This is when everything started to like really build in terms of like violence and conflict, in addition to what had already taken place.
Mhm.
And they started to build these mines, and as happens when you build a mine, to make profit, you have to exploit the people working for you. Um, so a coilery, which is like a coal mine, apparently, is what I learned, was built, and coal mining began in 1854 after the completion of the Mine Run Railroad. And one thing that's very interesting about this is that the railroad people and the mining people were like married. Like they were in each other's pockets, and they were in charge of everything that took place in these areas. Like the
Hmm.
government did not exist. Like they did, but they like didn't. It was new government, 1776.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
were still figuring stuff out. Like no one was really being like, "Hey, don't do that.
Yeah.
Hey, that's bad. Stop it." No, there were no rules because the government was in one town or city, and then they were like, "We don't really have reach everywhere else." Everything was run by the states until the Civil War. And this is when everything started to get bad, as expected. So, a mining engineer at the Locust Mountain Coal and Iron Company named Alexander Rhea was given charge of the town, and he tried to rename it Centerville in the hopes that it would become a center point for commerce in the area. However, once the post office was established, because that was didn't exist yet. So let's just give you more
Yeah.
context of like how wild this time period was in terms of like they were not following the rules.
Wild, wild
The
east.
yeah. The post office was made, and they were like, "You can't have that name. That name already exists." And they didn't have the internet, so they didn't know that. So he was like, "All right, I can't have it be Centerville. I'm going to have it be Centralia instead." And that's how that went. So as the mining industry grew in that area, so did the population of the town, as well as the railroad industry. So a lot of railroads were built, a lot of mines were built, and additional mines were built in surrounding towns. So it was just like a hotbed for railroad industry and mining industry. Um, and because of the Lehigh and Mahoney Railroad, this enabled transport and expanded sales of coal from Centralia to markets further east in PA. It really just started to make it boom economically for the specific people who owned the coal mines and the people who were deemed worthy of the financial resources. So consider in the time, I think it's very obvious who that was, which is Anglo-Saxon white people. And with the growing industry, the greed of companies operating the railroad and mining operations fueled just like working class people's discontent with what was happening, specifically immigrant populations who had moved to the town. For further context, this is like when most Irish American immigrants started to go into the US because it was after the potato famine and they were looking
Mhm.
for opportunities in the United States. A lot of them moved to the Centralia area and ended up being mine workers at a lot of these factories slash mining companies, like all these places that were industry locations that working class Anglo-Saxon people did not really want to work at, went to immigrant populations, and specifically, who I'm going to be focusing on is the Irish American immigrants that were really working to unionize mine workers at this time.
Mhm.
So, as the profits started to increase, discontent surrounding working conditions also increased because as you're making a lot of money to make profit, you usually do have to inherently within capitalism underpay your staff. So, specifically, a group called the Molly Maguires operated in and around Centralia and were a group of Irish American immigrants that were working to organize unions of mine workers to improve wages and working conditions. Apparently, the Molly Maguires were already well known across like Europe in that a lot of them were from Ireland and like fought up against landlords back
Mhm.
in Ireland. So they were also known for a fair amount of violence taking place in Centralia throughout the late 1960s in response to unfair working conditions. According to History.com, the Molly Maguires are suspected to have committed a rash of violence within Centralia, including the murder of the town founder, Alexander Ray, who I mentioned previously. They were accused of murdering him in his buggy in 1968, and it is theorized that the possible press and documentation of this union group was falsified by mine and railroad owners to dissuade further unions from forming. So
Hmm.
they really made an example out of the Molly Maguires. And like the history of the Molly Maguires, I'll get into, but like they had been around for a really long time. So like this was a big deal. Um,
Mhm.
and they might not have even been called that. Like there's a lot of conflicting information. Like it seemed like they were very much looking for a scapegoat as well. But
Mm.
I did not live during this time, so I really could not tell you. I don't know. But that's what the internet said, so that's what I'm going with for right now. And basically, it is theorized that they were embellished to be more horrible than they were in order to like downplay unions and also like sway Americans to be mad at them, to be like,
Mhm.
civil unrest is not worth this. You're doing fine. So don't care about these other people. Don't care about the immigrant populations because you're benefiting from us bringing industry and wealth into this town. And then, like in the comic book that Gabe was talking about, they're like, okay, it's
Mhm.
not real. We're just not going to look at it and it won't exist. So that's what a lot of people did. And apparently, from the same history.com article, it said as Pennsylvania historian Darrell B. Johnson notes, the Molly Maguires were implicated in everything from the murder of the town's founder, Alexander Ray, to the death of the area's first priest. Some believe that the Mollies were guilty, while others claim that the Mollies were framed by owners of the mines who feared that the member of the Mollies and other organizations would organize mine workers into unions. Uh, they write that eventually, after a brutal attempt to subdue the Mollies, that the execution of some of the group's suspected leaders happened in 1877, and subsequently the crime wave ended.
Yeah.
Uh,
What if
the
it were there in the
attacks,
first place?
yeah, I mean, they definitely were murdering people, but like, I think the why is important here.
Mhm.
So I'll get into the why. The attacks against unionization is something that haunts Pennsylvania and other industry-heavy states, in that many unions were stomped out by big corporations with violence, and thus the unions had to enact violence back in order to make progress. Um, Specifically, there's like many like kind of under histories, like people who like you have to like hide these in places because a lot of people don't want you to know about them, which I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but it's like real. Um,
Yeah. No, it is true.
it's fine. But the Molly Maguires had a long history extending back to North Central Ireland, as I said, in the 1840s, as an offshoot of a long line of rural secret societies, including the White Boys and the Ribbon Men, who responded to miserable working conditions and evictions by tenant landlords with bloody vengeance in Europe. What was really interesting
Hmm.
about this is how Molly Maguire's and the handling of their trial resulted in like the very much stomping out of unions in
Mhm.
the like specifically Pennsylvania for 2 decades. Essentially, the handling of the trial and the exploitation of the mining and railroad industry all tie back to the very like kind of violent period both within Centralia, but also like this period of civil unrest in Eastern PA. Uh, so History.com article outlines the origins of the Molly Maguires, goes to outline how the incident where the founder of Centralia, Alexander Ray, was murdered, uh, and like how that came to be. So what's very interesting is that on the like Centralia PA site, it's just like this wonderful man was murdered.
Yeah.
The founder of our wonderful town was murdered for no reason. The Molly Maguires were just thugs and like gangs just roaming around murdering people and causing havoc. And it was like, okay, maybe,
Mhm.
but also like why would they want to murder him? Well, what's
Yeah.
happening there? So essentially, there was a lot of reasons, and specifically Irish Catholics that had immigrated to Eastern Pennsylvania were and were living in like Centralia and like other Eastern PA locations were unable to find employment because at this time they were very discriminated against in terms of businesses being like Irish need not apply, you
Mhm.
cannot work at my business. So then they ended up having to work at like more physically demanding and dangerous mining jobs that were available at the time. So the men and their family were forced to live in overcrowded company owned housing, buy goods from company owned shops, and visit company owned doctors. In many cases, workers wound up owing their employees at the end of each month. So I don't know if you guys who are listening to this now also listen to our Octavia Butler episode where we talk a bit about how the whole development of the industry towns in that sense, it's all based on like real stuff in that
Mhm.
these things have already happened. Industry towns have already been tested and found to be like very exploitative and dangerous in that at the end of the month, you end up owing your employer instead of getting an actual wage and salary. So it ends up being slavery. Of sorts. Um, so essentially, at the start of the Civil War in 1861, when the draft began, many Irish miners were drafted to join. Already financially disenfranchised, the Molly Maguires and other Irish unions allegedly threatened coffin notices to all mining supervisors and scabs, as they call people who go across strike lines, um, that were planning to fill their roles in the strikes when they were drafted. As the working conditions worsened, the violence escalated, and it's said that 24 mine foremen and supervisors were assassinated, allegedly by the Molly Maguire and other Union people, including Centralia's Alexander Rose, or Rose Ray, Alexander Ray. Of course, instead
Hmm.
of asking like why this civil unrest was happening, the industry heads doubled down in their plans to destroy the unions and set a precedent to all others interested in unionizing. In 1873, Franklin B. Gowen, the president of the Reading Railroad, hired a Pinkerton detective agency to infiltrate and destroy the Molly Maguires, whose union organizing became an impediment to the increasing railroad profits. Using the alias James McKenna, native Irishman James McParlin spent 2.5 years living alongside the coal miners, eventually gaining their trust. Despite the conflict of interest, Gowen then went on to serve as the chief prosecutor during the subsequent trials. Based almost entirely on McParlin's testimony, 20 men were sentenced to death, 10 of whom were executed on June 21st, 1877, also known as Black Thursday.
Hmm.
Although the existence of the Molly Maguires as an organized band of outlaws in America is still debated, most historians now agree that the trials and executions were an outrageous perversion of the criminal justice system. In 1979, more than 100 years following the hanging, John Kehoe, the supposed king of the Molly Maguires, was granted a full pardon by the state of Pennsylvania, in that they recognized that this trial totally ignored like due process or any kind of rights. The case in which
Mhm.
the Molly Maguires were destroyed by the Pennsylvania government, or not even by the government, by these like industry heads, is one that definitely haunts the town and the areas surrounding Centralia. In fact, the Maguires were later pardoned, as I said, by the state, as they were not granted a fair trial, nor was evidence collected against them done legally. In explorepahistory.com, the execution of Molly Maguire's historical marker article, they say what took place, according to historian Harold Arand, was one of the most astounding surrenders of sovereignty in American history. A private corporation initiated and the investigation through a private detective agency, a private police force arrested the alleged offenders, and the coal company attorneys prosecuted them. The state only provided the courtroom and the hangman. Um, what followed was the cementing of Gown's control of the coal industry and the crushing of union activity in the coal regions for close to a decade. The exploitation of the population there and the wealth that followed is what grew Centralia in size and recognition for the rest of the 1800s and into the 1900s. The executions of the Molly Maguires did not stop the Great Rail Strike of 1877, however, that took place in Pittsburgh. And essentially continued across other rail yards throughout the state. However, it did start the precedent of unmonitored industry led violence on unions in Pennsylvania, as well as against railroad and coal workers and companies. The steel companies, coal companies and railroad companies continued to use Pinkerton agents, which is the private police force, to enforce their will upon workers and their families. The article goes on to explain that Henry Frick, the chairman of the Carnegie Steel Company, used Pinkerton agents in 1884 to guard his coal fields from strike breakers, in 1891 to protect Italian strike breakers, and again with disastrous results during the Homestead strike of 1892. Only then did the state of Pennsylvania become alarmed that private armies rather than public servants were wielding police powers in William Penn's Commonwealth, including the powers to enter private homes, disperse crowds, and arrest and imprison citizens. So
Jeez.
essentially, for a very long time, like
Mhm.
almost until the 1900s, were industry towns basically not being run at all by the state of Pennsylvania, but entirely by these corporations who were exploiting them,
Mhm.
and making them work for no money and doing horrible things to them. And the benefit always went to the people who were not experiencing that, the people who were getting the funding from these things. It wasn't until like the 1900s when industry started to shift in that World War One was incoming, the Great Depression, as well as the transition into oil instead of coal, that
Mhm.
the companies were just like, all right, we've exploited you for all these years. We don't care anymore. Goodbye. And abandoned all these people that lived in these towns, which I mean, they shouldn't have been there in the first place. I get like they were doing harm, but also like totally gutted these towns by taking the industry away as well. So, as I said, in the early 1900s, at the start of World War One, many young men were drafted and left Centralia, leading to a decline in its prosperity. In addition, many strikes led to the industries pulling out of the mining. So, it's not like they stopped protesting and trying to form unions and, you know, trying to oppose these inherently exploitative environments. It's just that once they finally started to make headway, all the
Mhm.
industries were like, all right, well, we don't want to work here then.
Mhm.
Uh, so the Great Depression really cemented this, as well as the transition to oil for fuel. Many mines in and around Centralia closed, and the town shrank down in size. As Gabe said, is like by the 80s, there were only 1,000 people living there. When all the industry run mines closed, what followed was bootleg mining, where individuals took coal from the mines without training or regulations. Not that they really had regulations much before. And the Centralia Council specifically bought the areas, mines, and the minerals beneath the town in 1950 in attempts to like still profit from it.
Mhm.
The town's population at this point was just under 2,000, but the mining industry just took a really long time to die out in that region because there was still coal within the mines. And it
Mhm.
continued through the early 1960s, which is when all of the remaining companies shut down, and with little work people began to leave. All of this to say is like really soon after that it like ran until the 60s, and then 2 years later the mine fire happened.
Mhm.
So
So not as many
a
people
lot
are
of
even there.
yeah, and then like in addition to that it's just like already so much awful had taken place there. Like the landscape of Centralia seems like it's like experienced a lot of kind of horrific things. And in reading about it, like none of that was talked about. Like it was always just like we existed here and there was just families and people working and it was a great old time and no one ever had a problem. Uh
Mhm. And then
but
we were
our
on
founder
fire.
got murdered and then we're on fire. Like and it was all like very like happy sounding and it was really weird. So in my research I just found it really interesting that what was highlighted, as well as just like how I just didn't know any of this. Like I knew there were strikes and I knew there were like, union busting and I knew there was like industry towns and that things had happened, but like I didn't know all the specifics. um
Mhm.
and like to get this picture, I had to like look up who the Molly Maguires were. I had to like look up specifically Alexander Ray's murder because everything on the Centralia website was just like he was great, and then he was murdered for no reason, and that was so strange. But there was a reason he was murdered is because he was exploiting people. I think I'm saying
Mhm.
that word wrong, exploiting people.
Mhm.
But yeah, so the belief that the Molly Maguires were nothing but rogue gangs dedicated to causeless violence seems to be perpetuated still, even on the Centralia PA website. Uh, and that the mine owner Alexander Ray, who contributed to worker exploitation and disenfranchisement is looked upon as this like innocent, well-to-do victim. And it's just weird. It's just a weird vibe. It very much gives
Mhm.
off the energy of the story the kid was talking about, like not specifically with like women in the patriarchy, but like men doing awful stuff. Definitely like just weird vibes, and, like, the fact that, like, they just don't talk about it, really. Like, I remember
Mhm.
hearing something, like, a while back, specifically within TikTok, so, like, not that it was a necessarily reputable source, but that, like, the whole sweeping things under the rug in terms of, like, mining towns and unions is, like, pretty long history in the United States because of the corporations, like, doing a really good job writing, like, articles that, like, once you get past a certain point in history, all you really have is what was written by the press, to really go
Mhm.
off of, like, personal diaries or stuff like that. So it's, like, easy to rewrite history to benefit a certain group,
Yeah.
and that's very much what
Also,
took
some of
place.
those workers probably couldn't write anyway.
Yeah, no, 100%.
Literacy was definitely down.
Yeah, and I mean, if like these families were being totally controlled by these corporations, I almost guarantee that they were not sending these children to school.
Mhm.
They were raising them to work in these factories or in these mines also.
Mhm.
And I mean, I'm not even talking about like when child welfare laws started.
Mhm.
It's very possible children were working in these mines. I didn't find specific information on that, so like take that with a grain of salt. But I think it is fairly likely based on how unmonitored these areas were, and how
Mhm.
totally in control these industries were over these areas. Like literally no government intervention whatsoever. It was totally run by like this private organization. And that's why trickle
Yeah.
down economics doesn't work, friends. Because when rich
Mm.
people are just in charge of anything, they're not going to do the right thing. So that's, if anything, this is a little lesson if you didn't know already. But I highly recommend like learning about that part of it and less about like the on fire part. Cause like the on fire part was interesting, sure. But like it's really weird to me, or I guess not weird, it's weird to me, but not surprising that like none of that was easy to find. um, I mean, it was once I like Googled specific stuff, but like with just Centralia in general, nothing I found
Mhm.
mentioned any of this stuff. Um, so yeah, I recommend like doing some research on unions in Pennsylvania or just like in the United States in general, and let me know what you find. I'd be lovely interested to learn about it, because this is super interesting to learn about, and I hope I said it correctly. So let's get into the mind fire. It's the last section of my section. It took me a while to get here, but welcome. Um, the mine fire is what most people think of when they think of Centralia, in that on May 27th, 1962, the city of Centralia's local firefighters allegedly set fire to the town landfill in attempts to clean it up in preparations for the upcoming Memorial Day holiday. What the firefighters didn't realize was that the landfill connected to the mines underneath the town. And as they attempted to extinguish the fire, they left ash and water in its place. A few days later, they were shocked to find that the fire continued to burn. Um, they don't really go into like what led into that, even as Gabe was saying. It's like there's a lot of like allegedlys being thrown around,
Mhm.
but ultimately the town was on fire, and there were many attempts made to put out the fire, but it was not able to be put out. And then instead of like dealing with that in a real way. Like no one left ultimately. Like everyone stayed in the town despite the fact it was on fire.
Mhm.
And like no one really wanted to talk about it. So as the mines were filled with unmined coal, it would make sense that these fires were extinguishable once it got underneath there. And the town coexisted with the fires for many like decades, 2 decades specifically. They continued to grow and spread. It wasn't until a boy apparently fell into a sinkhole, uh, and when carbon monoxide gas began seeping into homes, that the government had to evacuate residents. Um, because now, after all these years, it was like, hey, maybe don't do that, uh, in here.
Mhm.
So many of the local residents were evacuated voluntarily and the rest forcibly. On the Centralia PA website detailing the event, it states Many accepted buyout offers from their properties and moved elsewhere. After leaving, their homes were leveled. In 1992, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania used eminent domain to take control of all the property within the town. The remaining buildings were condemned and the residents asked to leave. Many did, but few remain and sued for their right to say. The lawsuits would last for nearly another 2 decades. During this time, the town's population continued to decline as residents willfully left or were evicted from their homes. In 2013, the lawsuits ended, and the 8 remaining residents were allowed to stay as long as they lived. Today, only a few buildings remain within the borough. So today, the town is mostly abandoned, covered with graffiti, and is a tourist destination. The fires have started to finally dissipate, so the ash and the steam is less present. But I believe it's still on fire. It has become a tourist attraction because of the attention that media highlighting or like in reference to the town uh, brought to it, specifically Silent Hill, and that it's become kind of like a tourist trap. But there's not much there to see.
Yeah, it's just like graffiti on the ground. Some people are
Yeah,
like they are allowed to move back there now.
well, that's good, I
I
guess.
read that somewhere. Like they're allowed
Yeah,
now. Yeah, yeah. Um, that is super interesting. Just like
yeah, and I mean, I'm sure it's not just like the Irish people. I'm sure they were exploiting all kinds of people. I'm sure they were just doing a bad time to everybody who was
mhm.
there, who did not fit the white supremacist ideal. So I didn't find like specifics on that, but if anyone else does, please let me know because I would love to include it, uh, even though it
Yeah,
sucks.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, for sure. It's yeah, I think it's crazy. The We kind of touched on like the not industry towns, but it's kind of hinted at in Sorry to Bother You. I talked about The Heart Goes Last, Margaret Atwood's
hmm
book, which has not industry town, but they like remodeled a prison to be this industry place where you lived and you worked so that you
yeah,
can just like have a place to be and
yeah,
just be exploited to survive, which is just like that's kind of how we exist now, but times
like
20.
slightly. Yeah,
Just like a little more where you're like, okay, wait a second. Yeah,
yeah,
I think it's also interesting to have like like in the similar way that she tied in the boy falling into the sinkhole because that scene really stuck out to me because I was like, oh my god, her kid just got straight up
yeah,
ate up, and like the young people in the town are very much just like, why are we still here? Like, why are
yeah,
people like you should not
and
be here
like
anymore?
yeah, and I think it's wild that that's like a real thing that happened. Like that's the only reason Pennsylvania was like, "Hey, maybe you shouldn't live here," is because like a small boy fell into a sinkhole, and they were like, "Hey, that was horrifying. Maybe you need to leave." But like before
Mhm.
that, they're like, "It's fine. Live there for 2 decades with it entirely on fire. No big deal. We're not going to do
Yeah.
anything," because they weren't doing anything there before. They were
Mhm.
just like, "Do whatever you want. We're not worried about it. Let everybody just not have rights. It's totally chill." Pennsylvania, that's okay. That's why our state is so wild in
Yeah.
terms of like Philadelphia,
Pennsylvania.
Pittsburgh, middle. Um,
Mhm. Everywhere
because
else.
it's like no one has governed there, so they don't know what stuff is.
Yeah. I think it's crazy that it was like the companies were literally like the police, the government, the everything. They were like, "We are everything in this
Uh,
town. You belong to us." Period. I mean, that's just like it's
100%.
kind of
They
America,
were in
but
charge of
yeah.
everything. Like no government whatsoever did anything except for just like supply them with weapons and like stuff like to murder these people. Like it was really
Mhm.
wild. They're like, it's fine because we benefit from the industry and money you bring into this area. So do
Mhm.
whatever you need to do to get that money, guy. Totally chill, totally fine. We're not worried about it until we like need to be, I guess. When it starts
Yeah.
to impact other people, then we'll be worried about it. Or when like you start to get like human rights violations, then we'll care.
Mhm.
When other
Yeah.
countries are like, "Hey, United States, what are you doing? It's
Yeah.
bad.
Or like we
You're doing
could
a
have
bad
made
time."
money for something and you're making it instead.
Yeah.
then we gotta
No,
pop in
100%.
because can't have that.
And I mean, I
Yeah.
researched this like over the last few days. I'm sure there is much more information that I didn't even find, and I would love to learn more
Mhm.
about. But it was fascinating at the end of the day. Um,
I
and it's
agree.
gross.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think for both of them, it's just yeah, and I think we're gonna I I think there's a haunted towns in our future because just like talking about Detroit's very specific problems, talking about Centralia's specific problems, I was like, there are like, and I mean, we did like haunted sunken houses, and that was a little dive into haunted towns in a way. And I think it's
Mhm.
pretty interesting, and I really enjoy learning about these things, and this history that just isn't ever going to be taught in schools. So
Yeah.
you can come here instead. It's like stuff you
Yeah.
missed in history class, except we're not them.
Yeah.
um,
And
yeah,
also,
for
like,
sure.
hopefully it's just a jumping off point because I don't know everything, but I just learned
Hmm.
some stuff. And hopefully you're like, I want to learn even more. And then you guys, listeners, go do that
Hmm.
with your
Yeah.
media analysis classes on.
Yeah, and if you know anything, if you are connected to anyone over in Centralia, you've been there before, let us know. You can send us comments on the video. You can shoot us an email, theghouls@gmail.com. Just let us know what's going on, what you think. If you've read this book, if we have suggestions for other comic books that we could cover on the show, let us know. We'd love to hear from you. We'll be wrapping up our haunted series somewhat soon. We got some really heavy things to unpack coming up, and then
Hmm.
we'll be in a new year. So,
Yeah. New year, new
yeah,
us, I guess, you know?
hopefully.
Who even are we next year? Like,
Yeah, it's like
what
new
is who's cat,
me,
who's Gabe? I don't know.
new goals.
Who will they be? How will they look? What
They'll
will they
probably
talk
be pretty
about?
cool.
I don't know. Yeah.
I think they'll be
I
cool at
imagine.
the very least.
Yeah. I feel like every year we get more interesting as people. At
We get
least I'd
cooler.
like
We
to
get
think
cooler.
that.
I agree.
Yeah.
I think so too. Um, y'all stay cool too. We hope to see you in the next year. If you have things you want us to cover in the new year, we're open. We're excited to hear about ideas and throw out some pitches for ourselves and see where the year takes us because we're always moving and adapting. And hopefully, we'll have another good year of horror. You know, the pandemic's going to
Yeah.
do that to you.
Yeah. There's been like so many, so I imagine there'll be so many more.
All
10 out of
right.
10.
Well, don't get married
Delete your kids. Or they'll
or
fall
it
into a
falls into a
sinkhole.
sinkhole.
Yeah.
Okay, bye.